Howdy, all of you delicious people. I'm here today to review Jonah Hex. So, of course, this is a Western DC comic book movie where we have a supernatural character not really fighting supernatural things. Having this character really using his supernatural power to really just track down where his villain is. And that's about as a bulk of what we really have this character's power, so to speak, being used for. We assumed that the villain Turnbull is to be dead in this movie, but then we find out the very exact opposite, because heaven forbid we'd actually have a supernatural superhero fighting a supernatural character, which would make a lot of sense. To the point, really, of us just having really some goofy weapon that, of course, they are at first calling it the trigger device and then end up calling it the nation killer. A weapon called the nation killer where it doesn't exactly do what it's said to do because it barely is to blow up a city at some point. Going in this film, I think we have a big, massive cast on our hands, but it feels wasted. We have a ton of people who had gone on to do a number of supernatural shows or movies, aka Wes Bentley here went on to do, or was the villain of Ghost Rider, so it's kind of weird having him here as a character called Lusk. We have Jeffrey Dean Morgan kind of barely used in this film for whatever reason, as of course Jab. We have Michael Fassbender in here as of course Burke. And then, of course, we have John Malkovich, who's kind of been in any number of things, like Warm Bodies and so on and so forth. Speaking of bodies, we, of course, have Megan Fox from Jennifer's Body in this film, who is to be, of course, be playing Lila, or Tallulah. Lila, I guess, is a nickname that evidently this girl is to be given. So, really, what the heck is Jonah Hex about? Well, it seems the main reason why this character bizarrely just consistently gets used everywhere, to the point of him getting used in certain kind of animated stuff. Like he was used at some point in the Justice League Unlimited show because they needed something to do. Like when they did that whole time travel episode where they're going from the distant past in the Western, they of course added Jonah Hex there, and then they went into the future where they used like Batman Beyond's Batman, and like that whole episode where they did that, they ended up using Jonah Hex in there. There's certain random times where they end up using Jonah Hex. Jonah Hex is even in DC Legends of Tomorrow, much more currently, I guess. He's in DC Legends of Tomorrow. So it seems like this character is randomly used, and I think that this is a character that you honestly feels in bad taste to still use this character. I think there could have been really just better supernatural characters that they can always use besides Jonah Hex, but they just keep shoving this character out there, making him seem like a much more better character being used for some odd reason. And I'm just like, you know what? There's Etrigan. You can use Jason Blood for an episode or something. Finally get the Demon Etrigan out there for a good use. But because they can do either both Jason Blood or Etrigan, they could do it in a number of interesting ways. You could also put Zatanna out there. If you can't use Constantine, you can use any number of certain other characters, like Dr. Fate. Like, kind of gets used mostly in a lot of like DC animated stuff, but it is what it is with these characters. I guess Jonah Hex is kind of the easy grab because it's probably the cheapest supernatural character, and hence why you probably had a very cheap done movie by, of course, this here, where I guess really just DC wanted to really just Warner Brothers and DC Comics just really wanted to do a Western superhero movie, and plus they wanted to have something to tie into supernatural, but not enough in this film. So, with that said, we end up having a character who is to be forced to be branded upon his face, hence why his face still looked the way it does, because he had gotten branded by, of course, his villainous character Turnbull. And so we go on and now have, because Jonah Hex had lost his family because, of course, Turnbull, now Jonah Hex is going and seeking vengeance upon Turnbull whenever he gets the time to feel interested in going after this guy again, because he's busy going and bounty hunting and killing a bunch of guys. And then he's like, well, I guess I'll go, like, and just go after Turnbull now. Like, I think it's been enough time. Like, we naturally assume, like, I think Jonah was to naturally assume that Turnbull was dead at some point. So, but we go on into in this movie, and, like, I'll be honest, it seems like they go into weird, goofy directions with this character. They try to make things so seemingly look cool, but when really looking at it, we have a director that this is probably his first ever film and only film, and so once we get to the action parts, there obviously is a director here that doesn't know how to do them, or really is to chop the crap out of these scenes to where it just loses all its value when we actually do get to the action parts. We also get a movie that, again, like, is just a western, because there is no supernatural movie here, and so it just kind of, the most interesting part that should be in place about this movie isn't really all that existent enough. Even though there are certain spots and things that Jonah does do, still this comes off as 90% western, 10% supernatural at most, or at best. So really, that's all that I have to say about this movie. I'll admit that I had seen this movie once before. I don't know whether it was in theaters or it was possibly uh, at some point just like renting it somewhere. Because I did have a lot of interest, just because simply this was a supernatural character that, of course, was to be kind of used in certain kind of things sparingly. It had nothing to do with the whole, like, Civil War attachment, or him being, of course, from the South. Weirdly, simply because I think this guy is mentioned in the movie that all that he wanted to do was to have his own, uh, like, to control his own destiny instead of having someone control it for him, which is to basically be the president. And so that's why Jonah Hex was to go on to the South, simply because he was to want to control his own path of things and not have his path being chose for him by other people. So going into this film, yeah, let's just go into it. Let's just go into that double five time territory. What would I say about this movie? I can't go out of my way and say that this movie is a okay or good film. Really, I just have to say it's a movie that exists. Like, we have a bunch of those kind of, like, quasi supernatural movies out there, like Dylan Dog, or just other kind of things that just are to be way more supernatural than this is. Like, I would just have to deem this movie a Western film, and I don't think this is even a good Western film, in all honesty. Just because it is a revenge movie that, of course, has that kind of Crow kind of feel, but I would much rather watch a Crow film. Like, I would much rather watch anything else besides this, because this has still got to be hands down DC's worst uh, comic book movie. And hence why whenever anyone is to say, it's like, well, yeah, like, DC has gone and done some good movies, I'm like, well, yeah, but they've done some freaking awful ones too. Straight up awful ones, and this has to be one of them. And, like, I would even deem that the sequel to Ghost Rider is better than this movie, just because it's an actual supernatural movie that is to seem like what it is to, like, put on. and so on and so forth. So with that said, let's go into that double five. Let's just go into spoilers about this movie. So this is a bad film, but a film that eventually people will see because they're like, oh, uh, Megan Fox is in this movie. Oh, Michael Fassbender. Oh, like it'll basically intrigue them simply because of the cast, and then they'll go, oh, yeah, this sucks. So let's go into it. Let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time we get to spoil this movie. So, of course, in the very beginning of this film, we have Jonah Hex's character mentioning that War and him uh, are to take to each other well, and that Jonah had gone on and shot through a number of Civil War North guys dressed in blue, with tents that are kind of like, man, this is kind of like skimping on the visuals here, because really they're skimping on the money on this movie a lot. So we go and we push on, and we of course have Jonah, who we find out later in the film had gone on and killed Turnbull's son named Jeb, and because Jeb was forced to get orders from his father telling him to blow up a hospital, and so Jonah Hex refused to have this hospital get blown up, and so he shot Jeb because Jeb was to be drawing on Jonah to force him to do this, because it seemed that Jeb was to need to do what his father told him to do. So we have Jonah Hex who shoots Jeb, and now because Jonah had done that, Turnbull is to go and find, of course, Jonah Hex's family and basically burn their house down and kill both Jonah's wife and son. And now Turnbull is going to let Jonah Hex go free here, but he's going to brand him with his name so that way everybody knows that that Turnbull is basically owned by, or that Jonah Hex is now owned by Turnbull for the rest of his life. And because of the pain that Turnbull had been given because of the loss of his son, like he wants to just figure out a way to torture Jonah Hex even much more so, but like leave him like alive to where he is to, for the rest of his life, mourn the loss of his son and daughter, which he had lost, and basically be humiliated for the rest of his life also, because everyone is to ask him, what happened to your face? And then he shoots the guy and he's like, what happened to yours? So, because we transition to go into, of course, this bar. And, oh no, wait, no, wait, let's transition elsewhere. Yeah. So after Jonah Hex is to supposedly have this long animated sequence where we of course have this being like 20% of the movie, I think, is like animated. So we have Jonah going on, and I guess after he had been left for dead, there had been a bunch of Native Americans that had retrieved Jonah Hex because Jonah Hex's wife was Native American also. And so they had retrieved him and revived him, and I guess will never actually let him die. It's kind of like the Extraordinary Gentleman with kind of Sean Connery, how like Africa won't let me die kind of thing. So like it's kind of the same thing with Jonah Hex, where we just have every single time these Native Americans going and finding Jonah Hex and kind of going on to like let him die, or let him kind of resurrect himself after he is to, of course, be killed at some point. So we now push on to a much more current time, having supposedly Turnbull supposedly to be dead, but we find out that is actually incorrect. So Jonah Hex is going on to drag these guys with his horse, and he has a head and a sack also, to chuck to the sheriff and this mayor of this town, so that way he can get his $100 for this bounty. And so we of course have these guys saying like, well, it looks like you were dragging three brothers. There's a fourth brother. And so of course Jonas chucks this head that's in this bag. It's like, well, that guy was too fat for my horse. So we go on and we have these people refusing to pay the bounty to Jonah Hex. And they're refusing to do that because Jonah Hex's bounty is much more heftier than either one of these guys. And so they want to just decide to just kill Jonah Hex right now to then turn him in. And so all of a sudden we have Jonah Hex busting out these Gatling guns that are of course coming from his horse, and he's just firing away and going on to eventually take the sheriff's badge and just chuck it onto this one kind of drunk of a guy. And he's like, congratulations. And so after he's to walk away from this town, the town is to weirdly, bizarrely blow up. And so Gatling gun horsey for the win. We even have one point where someone was to jump out of this coffin for some bizarrish reason to try and get at Jonah here, and Jonah still shot him and killed him. And like, weird. So we go on and we now have, of course, Burke and his men all desperately wanting to go after this train to simply blow it up. Because it seems like they're planning explosives for this train to go under and for the train to go and blow up. We were to assume or assess that they were just going to rob this train like any traditional Western film, but it seems that instead they just desperately wanted to blow it up because there are, of course, some army men on top of this train, and we have kind of the superior kind of going through, kind of checking on everybody. So we then, of course, have us getting a newspaper stating that America is going to be turning 100 soon, and because it's going to be close to Independence Day, which is, of course, July 4th, if people didn't know that. So we go on, we have Lieutenant Grass going and telling, of course, President Grant at this point, because it's about that time period frame of whatever. And so, plus also America is now 100, so kind of put the timeline of when this actually is in place. So we go on and we end up having, of course, them telling us that Turnbull is still alive, and that it seems that they're going to need Jonah Hex to like save them from this whole problem, because if there's anybody that wants to go after Turnbull, it's Jonah Hex. So, and President Grant is like, yeah, like we're gonna desperately need this guy. So we go on and we now have, of course, Jonah Hex making it to this bar where, of course, he's insulted by his looks. And then he is to, of course, go off and meet with Lila, who, of course, is to be Ari Singh, a suitor guy that is wanting to leave his wife and kids and everything like that to go along with Lila. And she, of course, is refused because she just wants to just do the one-off job and let this guy go away. She's not going to run away with anybody anytime soon, or if she was, or if she does, it's going to be Jonah Hex. We rarely had this guy come back, still desperately wanting to go after Lila, to the point of her, like, to the point of this guy is like, well, like, if I won't have you, no one else will. And so he ends up shooting this single shot gun, and Lila ends up taking this guy out because, like, he can't shoot anymore out of this pistol, even though he desperately tries to. And so she ends up taking him out. So But anyways, so once Lila is to separate from this one appointment of hers, we end up having both Jonah Hex and Lila going on and talking about things, and so we end up having it to where there's some kind of like there's kind of weird effects going on with these characters and this kind of like them sleeping together, and plus like it looks very weird what they end up doing with Megan Fox's face in this scene here, but it's whatever. So after that, all of a sudden, Lieutenant Grass like kind of barges into this room where both Hex and Lila are in, and saying like, "Well, sir, like, we merely tell you that you are going to be working with the U.S. military, whether you want to or not, like, and we'll pay you for these services." I'm like, I'd be like, you like, no, like. We end up having him like almost wanting to like turn down like the military, and they're like, "Well, do you think that you can kind of shoot your way out of like a bunch of military men um, coming for you?" And so Jonah's like, "Okay, I'll go with you. Like, fine," because I think there was like 9 men present, and so like Jonah was forced to go on to do whatever they wanted. So Lieutenant Grass is going on and telling them about the advancements that the United States is making, how they're going on and having some electrical uh, like towers, of course, uh, and one guy is to freaking fall off of it. Like, wow, I see that's going to work out really well in the future. So we go on. We have Lieutenant Grass, who is to mention there is to be one guy that they were trying to interrogate, trying to get information about where Turnbull is. And so that forces, of course, Jonah to say, like, well, like, I'll get information out of him. And Lieutenant Grass is like, well, he's dead. Like, he died during our interrogation. And Jonah's like, well, I'll talk to him all the same. So Jonah goes to this man who is to, of course, be in this weird, goofy cage of things. And, like, it's a dead body, but they weirdly caged him up. And they cuffed him. So, yeah, that makes a lot of sense for a dead body. Like, so we just have Jonah who touches this body, and this body comes back to life because he has that weird ability about him, and like foreshadowing that this is going to happen sometime later in the movie. So Jonah touches this man and is to now like interrogate him as he's starting to feel the pain of him being sucked back uh, to where he's from. Um, because he's starting to lose his skin and stuff like that. And so we have Jonah who is like, well, hey, like that's kind of like the afterburn of things where like you're starting to burn back up because like the fresher the body is, the quicker that you're gonna burn back to who you are. And he's like, well, I can help you like kind of ease this pain if you tell me what you know. So we have this man telling that Turnbull had gone southeast, and so Jonah is to toss some dirt on this body, saying that like dirt loves dead and dead loves dirt, and so like really just kind of sprinkle some dirt on you, and like you can kind of regain your regained where it's not as painful. But then Jonah is to lose the grip of this man, and then all of a sudden he goes back to his normal dead self. So Jonah, of course, is telling Lieutenant Grass that this guy is going southeast. So now, of course, we end up having Turnbull, who is going to Charleston, South Carolina, to go and talk to Tusk, who, of course, is Wes Bentley here. Guy from Ghost Rider. So we of course go on and have Turnbull going on and talking to Tusk here, Alberman Tusk, and so we of course have Turnbull telling this guy that Tusk is kind of dealing under the table, and that all he really needs here is just where is the trigger device. And so Tusk is to hand him over that location, and so they weirdly have to break into a big, like, door vault, and then break into also another little, like, box that is to have what is to be called eventually the nation killer weapons, that are just to be these weird uh, orangey yellow looking balls, I guess. Like if you want to have like Dr. Octopus kind of tritium or whatever, where it's like the power of the sun at the palm of my hands. Like I guess this is to really just be what these things are. So, and eventually we later on see Turnbull, who's practicing how to use this weapon by launching them out onto this town and blow it all up, blow the whole entire town up. So I'm like, if this is a nation killer, like that seems to be a very small like place. But when really looking at it, they're worried. Like President Grant is eventually worried that they're going to attack big, massive events that have a ton of people. That because it's right around the Independence Day, so there's going to be some big, massive towns that are possibly going to get wiped out because they're all in one specific location. So that's actually pretty intelligent. That's actually pretty smart. So they're kind of naming off a bunch of big events that might be happening soon. And they're like, oh man, I hope Jonah Hex can kind of figure out like how to take Turnbull down. So we go on, and we of course have Jonah Hex going to make it to this carnival where he's to meet this guy named Slocum. So Jonah Hex is to make it into this one tent, I guess, by this carnival. And all of a sudden there is to be a fight out between this barbarian and this snake man. And really I was trying to figure out what exact like monster that this character is, but I couldn't find it. But the movie just calls him a snake man. So I'm like, okay, is he a vampire? Is he a, what is he exactly? Like I was trying to figure out what is the exact like thing that this person is, but all I could find was Snake Man, so that's what I just went with here. So we go on, and we of course have Jonah Hex talking to Slocum, and so really what Slocum is to tell, of course, Jonah Hex here is that maybe he should talk to Jeb, and Jonah's like, well, that's a good idea. And really, we just have Slocum who wants to go and chuck Jonah Hex in with this snake man, knowing full well that he'll probably get killed here. But instead, we have Jonah Hex kind of fight his way out to eventually chuck someone else in with the snake man. I think it's possibly Slocum here. And then he goes off and fights a number of guys who are weirdly trying to wrangle a dog into some cage somewhere, or they're just trying to wrangle this dog to possibly kill this dog for whatever reason. And so Jonah Hex weirdly comes into the defense of some dog to eventually go on and tell him it's like, well, hey, they're just mad because of your pretty looks, dog. Yeah. I'm like, what the fuck? You have to compliment a dog in this movie? Okay, sure, not only that, but then you have a massive amount of cuts being done in any fight sequence, which just ruins this film also, to where it's like, man, like the chopping up that they have to do for this action sequence makes no sense. Plus, every single one of these rooms are to be, or every single one of these places where they're to be lit up are just like way overkill. Like they had to like blow a massive budget on this movie, as if this movie was really just a like I think for this one was just some write-off. Like they were really wanting to just like, hey man, we're not going to put a good movie out there, we just want to just continue to figure out how to blow money. And so this is just that money that they're blowing on this film that they could care less, hence why you ended up having, I think, two guys working on this movie, and they decided to just bow out. They're like, no, I'm no. And then another guy who is severely inexperienced, I guess, because this is the only movie he's ever done, had gone on to direct this film, and then this is what we get. So we go on and we transition to have, of course, Jonah Hex going and unburying Jeb here. So Jeb, of course, every time Jonah is to go and bring him back to life, Jeb is to punch out Jonah and continue to just beat the crap out of him, to the point of Jonah then like laying on top of Jeb to where he cannot no longer punch him anymore. And so now Jonah is telling Jeb, it's like, okay, like, I'm gonna let you up as long as you don't beat me anymore. So we good? And Jeb's like, sure, fine. So they go on in the backstory about the whole hospital being blown up thing. And so Jeb is mentioning that he has watched Jonah and he has watched Turnbull, and he can't really tell the difference between the both of them. And that really we have it where Jeb is to, of course, tell Jonah that of course, Turnbull is at Fort Resurrection, and so I'm like, what a goofy name for some of this stuff here. But we have like some kind of like transition here, and so eventually Jeb is to be put back into his grave, and so on and so forth. So we go on and we have, of course, Jonah, who goes on to see Smith, who of course is to be this kind of James Bond Q kind of guy, where of course, like for every like one of these kinds of things, we have like Van Helsing, where eventually we have the one guy that is to kind of armor up Van Helsing and to give him all these new tricky toys that he didn't have before in some part of this movie to go and fight on this new threat. But weirdly, we have these like dynamite crossbow weapons that honestly make no sense for them to even have in this movie. I guess it's like the equivalent of a grenade launcher, technically, I guess. Somewhat like that. It's so weird. These like dynamite crossbows, so bizarre in this movie. But so we end up having, of course, Jonah Hex going to Fort Resurrection and blowing up a bunch of guys to make his way through there. And so we, of course, go on and have Jonah here, who ends up getting pretty well shot up during this whole situation. And so he ends up having to forcibly be dragged off by a horse for him to eventually die in some field where he's remembering, I guess, the very first time that him and Turnbull were to fight. Or, like, we really just have it where, like, I'm not quite sure what exactly this is. Like, the whole Turnbull and Jonah fighting here. Supposedly, they say in the movie that Jonah is to imagine he's fighting some enemy of his, because he's having this like weird trip of sorts where, like, when he's to die, he's to kind of fight his one last enemy while he's kind of just covered in this weird orange like dirt. Whatever with this movie. So, but we go on again and we have, of course, the Native Americans who again go on to find Jonah, go and take them into their tents and try to perform medicine on him, and go on and have him all of a sudden end up getting resurrected and having the smoke come out of his mouth and have this crow come out of his mouth. And really, we're just led to possibly believe that this resurrection story was possibly done from the beginning of this movie, and this is just to be happening again. Or this, like, maybe every single time that Jonah Hex is to die, he goes into this weird visuals of him somehow getting resurrected yet again, and so that's how he is to. This movie's weird. This movie's so odd and out of place and whatever. Um, but we also have Jonah Hex, like reminded about his family getting killed and how his son was uh, trying to learn to read, and Jonah Hex made fun of him because he was trying to learn how to read and how reading was pointless. What a good message to send, DC Comics. Yeah, hey, comic book people, don't learn how to read. That's smart. So, it's pointless. Yeah, whatever. So, and then we also have the same exact Turnbull speech where he's to mention you've taken everything that I love. Boo-hoo! So, but while that all craziness is going on, all that madness is going on, we have both Burke and Turnbull. We have Turnbull telling Burke, it's like, hey, really just go after Lila. I'm paraphrasing here, but like, yeah, go after that girl. So, we of course weirdly have Turnbull also going and blowing up that town, like I had said before, that little village, and using his Dragon Ball Z freaking weapons, his nation killers. So we go on and we have Burke, who is to go and find where Lila is because it's really just so complicated, right? She's only in this one bar in this one spot of town, and like, so it's very complicated to find her. Anybody could possibly stumble and find this woman, it seems. So Burke is to go on and whip his knife out, just whip it on out, just this big massive knife. This isn't a metaphor for anything, it's actual just a knife. And he's to kind of play around with Lila. But eventually what happens here is that Burke is to take Lila with him, so that way eventually they can use this as a hostage negotiating moment when they are to go and get Jonah Hex, when Jonah Hex is to arrive to try and stop them. So, bird flying out of somebody's mouth. So, just crow flying, just gross. Take that out of context, what I just did there. That'd be okay. So, we have Jonah Hex, who ends up going on and getting revived, and so he then goes and is to tell the U.S. whoever, military, Lieutenant Grass, President Grant, somebody, he goes and sends this message out via Morse code to tell them what all is technically going on. Stop. And then he is to, of course, tell this messenger all this stuff, and that he's going to go and try to prevent Turnbull. Stop. So with that, we go on, and of course we have Lusk, who's still just like, hey man, like, hopefully, like, all of this stuff that you do succeeds, because I don't want to be hung anywhere, and I want to avoid getting hung. And so Turnbull ends up going behind Tusk's back and shoots him in the head. And he's like, well, being hung is going to be avoided by you anyways, because you're dead now. So, because we have no more use for this character. So, Jonah Hex ends up coming back to, of course, where Turnbull is to be at, which I guess is to be on some boat of sorts. And so Jonah Hex is to go and find Burke and to fight him out here. And weirdly, while they're fighting out, we have, of course, them using flames or fire. Because I guess, like, him being burnt before is to be some kind of weird symbol of sorts. So we go on and we have Burke fighting with Jonah Hex. And so now we have the Batman Dark Knight situation where, of course, because we consistently have everybody always calling Jonah Hex ugly, and so Burke is going on and like, God, you are so ugly. Like we had Smith who's telling him like every time I see you, you get more and more ugly, and like I don't get what it is with this whole joke, but it always is to be that same old thing. So we go on and we have Burke saying like, "How can I get a face like that?" And Jonah says, "Well, I'll show you." And he ends up tossing this flame into Burke's face, pushing him off to then have, of course, them still fighting it out. And so Jonah ends up grabbing Burke and is to possibly, it seems, decapitate Burke, but instead it just looks like he ends up getting bashed in the head with whatever like kind of propeller thing that's getting spun around here. So we have, of course, when Jonah is to kill Burke here, he ends up saying at first that this is for his wife, and then he brings back Burke to go on and say, "And this is for my son," and he punches him, and him punches him just destroys this guy's face. So we go on now, and once Jonah Hex is to make it to this ship that these guys are on with this nation killer, we then all of a sudden have Turnbull who has Lila, and it's like, well, Jonah is going to surrender his gun so that way he can go and be tied up with Lila, so that way he can go on to learn what Lila's actual name is Tallulah, to where he's like, Tallulah? And she's like, yeah, it's like Lila's a nickname. He's like, but Tallulah? Yeah. So Jonah, of course, is asking Lila if she has any kind of secret hidden things within her. And of course, we have Lila just saying, like, no, they checked everywhere. And I mean everywhere. And so it's like, that's kind of like the Wild Wild West moment where both Will Smith and Kevin Kline were eventually like stuck together with those magnets, and we end up having, of course, where Will Smith was like asking Kevin Kline's character, it's like, well, like, do you have anything on you? Do you have any like do you have anything that just shoots out your butt and like and can help us here? And Kevin Kline's like, oh no, that's where Loveless would have looked first. It's like, but we end up finding out they had some tool, like, I think in his boots somewhere, and they're like, really? Out of all the places that they could have looked. So, but we have Jonah, who is to mention that maybe Lila can use her feminine wilds to get one of these guards to let them free. But eventually they end up somehow getting out of this whole rope situation, and they end up starting to blast through and shoot through all these guys. Big action moment, la-di-da-di-da. So eventually we have it to where the nation killer is eventually being used, where the president is to be going on and doing this July 4th celebrational thing. And it's kind of weird that these guys would take this risk to have the president in a possible hotspot, so to speak, to have this maybe possibly be a target. I guess they just had so much hope on Jonah Hex, hence why they were like, man, this nation is riding on Jonah Hex right now. Oh, man. Yeah, hopefully he's going to save us because we're not going to do as far as planning. So I think we end up having going on where one cannonball is to be tossed by the president, and no one is to really get hurt here. And so we go on and we end up having this shots were fired, and we still have this moment where we're still reflecting on that one goofy moment between both Turnbull and Jonah Hex, and some weird goofy flashback of sorts or dream sequence of sorts, where Jonah is still mentally grappling against his evilish villain in his own mind, while also actually grappling with his actual villain in present time. So why? These people just really needed time to kill for this movie, so let's kill it. So speaking of kill, of course, they end up going on and putting Turnbull's character into some device of this boat, and slowly but surely he is going to eventually get his comeuppance and to get killed. We eventually have one of the nation killers that is to go on and to blow up this boat. And luckily, we have both Lilith and Jonah Hex jumping off the boat at a perfect time to avoid this whole explosion, which doesn't actually make sense to me. That like they aren't dead right now, but like really Jonah Hex is already technically dead, so what more would that do for Lilith? So eventually when the boat is to blow up, we have Smith saying in the background, now that's a 4th of July. That's some real fireworks. That's some real finale movie. So with that said, we end up having at the end of this movie where Turnbull is now supposedly dead. We end up having President Grant, who is just so happy that Jonah Hex was to save the day, that he decides that he's going to make him sheriff of the whole United States. Sheriff of a continent. Weirdly. Shouldn't he have just called him a U.S. Marshal? Or some other kind of thing that actually makes sense for a title? Because we immediately have Jonah Hex who's like, wait a minute, like, a sheriff for a country doesn't make sense. And Grant is just like, well, but, like, wouldn't you just want the job? Wouldn't it be nice? Because eventually we end up having both, when we have Jonah Hex kind of leaving with a Lilith, we of course have Jonah Hex mentioning that he was off for this job, and she's like, well, are you going to take it? And he's like, no. Like, so we go on, we technically have these characters right off in the sunset, and so on and so forth, just kind of wrapping up this movie that isn't all that great at the end of the day, because I think it's time for me to say I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody. Just not a good movie. Just... it's interesting, but like when really looking at a bunch of obscure supernatural movies, like every single one of those are better than this one, because I feel like this isn't even a better Western film. If you can, like, I don't know what to really just say this really is, because it doesn't feel good enough to be any of those. But I reviewed it, I'm done with it, and that's great. So this is now covered. So with that said, Jonah Hex, if anybody ever actually views this, I do appreciate it. So I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.